for the despotic, anti-democratic states that are actually controlling this energy and have the ability over the next 40 years to use that control of energy, not only to increase their coffers, but to weaponize that energy in different. I don't think Europe is in any position to do anything right now with respect to Russia, except hope for the best, because they've created a complete dependency that has to be in other ways. So they're definitely, right now, what we need to do is we need to get rid of the false, fake, and unscientific activist language around the green environmentalist movement that is still wearing the bell bottoms from the 70s intellectually. They haven't caught up to what's actually happened through innovation in free markets. And we need to recognize 80% of global oil is held by non-democratic states. And what you're seeing right now, unbelievably, is the language of pacifism intersecting with energy politics by politicians that are completely feckless. And so what you've got is the Biden administration sending emissaries to Venezuela.
I came across your work in both the Wall Street Journal and I believe it was the New York Times. You had a really interesting article in there, and you came from a very realistic background. I appreciate that, from the strategic studies background. But before we get into that article and your sort of thesis, would you mind giving just a brief introduction of yourself and where you come at this problem set?
Sure. So I grew up in Alberta, Canada, which is a very oil-rich part of the world. More oil there than in Russia, China, and the United States combined, which is a surprise to a lot of people. And the fact that it's a surprise to a lot of people goes to the heart of what I think our challenges right now, from both a security perspective as well as an energy trade perspective. And we can talk more about that, but that's where I grew up. I left after going to university there. I did a PhD down in the US focused on politics, law, and demographic change, sociology. I did that at Yale University, and then I did my master's in law at Oxford University, and was focused on reasonableness doctrine and how we make decisions, how judges make decisions about issues that don't have specific laws written around them. So what are the normative ways that we think about what's right and when there isn't a specific law written around it? And then decided not to go into full-time academic work, which is what I'd been on the track to do, and went to McKinsey for a few years, left that to join a startup that was using sort of a model of intelligence to disrupt sell-side research, where we did an extended network of subject matter experts around the world and used fractional time to help them provide input into private equity, hedge fund, and consulting decision makers. That became a big firm. It's called GLG. And then I left that to run strategy for the International Bank of Commonwealth Bank of Australia. I ended up becoming the group head of strategy for a year there, interim, and then left that to go into government service, something I'd promised a good friend of mine. And that took me all the way back to Alberta to work for now Premier Jason Kenney, helped run his campaign, ran his transition team, and then served as his principal advisor for 2 years. And then I left that in the summer to get back, spend a little more time with my son, who I'd been missing badly through COVID and the inability to travel. And during that time, it gave me a chance to take a step back and think a little bit about what we've been trying to do in Alberta, and a couple different themes relevant to what we're going to talk about today. One is environmental, social, and governance screens that are being used by financial services. That goes by the shorthand ESG. Another is just the lack of common sense dialogue even around energy, this nexus between energy and climate and economy. And I think that because there's been such a strong politicization of the climate question, it's tended to create kind of this fog around how we understand what energy is, how it operates in the world, including how it operates to reduce emissions globally, especially gas replacing coal. And then economy, how important it is that democracies in particular see that their economic superpower status is what has created global peace. And if you let that go, particularly if you let it go in energy, which has this combination of being economically profound, but also can be weaponized to starve countries, as you're seeing happen to Germany right now, you recognize that we have to reset the terms, I think, of our conversation. So just to kind of wrap that up, about 3 weeks ago, I was at a conference in Lisbon with a few people there, and Brett Stevens, who's a writer for the New York Times, told me he'd never heard this argument that I was making, that actually under the cover of this broader strategy, which I believe is true about Vladimir Putin, that he is an ethno-nationalist, that he wants to sort of create this Russian sphere of influence based on the old ethnic, linguistic Russian enclaves across Belarus and into Kiev. Underneath all of that, he's also a thief, and he has very clear intentions of securing his strategic advantage in the way that he's positioned in the Ukraine, and securing and stealing as much of their energy as they can, which has two purposes. I had somebody say to me the other day, he doesn't need the energy, and I said, that's not the logic a thief thinks with. A thief doesn't need your watch either. He's going to take it from you if he can. And Putin doesn't need the energy because he's got enough. But the point is, by stealing it from the Ukraine, he achieves three objectives. One, he sends a message to the rest of the world that he's not to be toyed with, and he's willing to take full advantage of what I think has been a feckless Western European approach to energy and security. Two, he permanently disables Ukraine, which he's had a lot of frustrations with because of their moments where they've moved towards democracy. And three, he permanently secures for himself control strategically in that region of the Sea of Azov, the Black Sea, the Kerch Strait. And I think that we underestimate those things at our peril. I think it's very similar to Sudetenland in 1938. I believe that unless we start to think clearly about what it is that he's trying to achieve and understand that he has layered objectives that don't just consist of controlling Kiev, but that he's happy, even if we accept that this is a default setting or a plan B or C or D, the point is he gives them extraordinary advantages that he ought not to have by use of force. And if we allow it to stand, then we do that, I think, at our peril. And so that's the article that you saw in the Wall Street Journal. What was interesting was Brett, who's a good friend, quoted me in the New York Times, then CBS News picked it up. And after that, I was getting so many misstatements of what I was arguing. People saying that this was Russian misinformation, that I was saying that this was some sort of Putin-esque legerdemain where he had this, that I was saying that he had an advanced strategy, then this was a hidden tactic, that he was going to Kiev and sacrificing all those people. That's not the argument. So my argument is really contained in the Wall Street Journal article, and I appreciated your, our initial sort of discussion and the desire to talk more about it, because I think there's a lot more to unwrap than you can in 900 words. And so that's the whole background.
Well, it's a good thing you have a PhD in reasonableness, because you're going to need it to wade through the unreasonableness in discourse right now. Although I don't know if that helps when it takes two to tango. But what I appreciate about your perspective is you come from both your academic background, but your finance background, a firm grounding in geoeconomics. Litwack was, I guess, one of the more recent proponents of geoeconomics, but you're combining at the highest levels something that we've forgotten about for some reason, in that, the highest levels of strategy involve all domains. It's not just force from a strategic studies background, but it's energy, it's your nature of democracy and control of discourse. So I wonder if you can lay out, just for the benefit of those that may not have seen those interviews, how you look at the play that he is taking with energy and commodities, and what type of effect that might have on the alliance if we don't take this seriously, and what does that do to both commodity markets as far as putting pressure on Europe, and what could that do to currency regimes and the prominence that we've had as the West? Well,
I'll start with basically the premise of my argument. And I do this with complete humility. You and your cohort have done more thinking about strategy and tactics and the differentiation between those two than I have. So forgive elements of what I'm going to say as being slightly amateurish. because I'm in, to the extent that I'm talking about areas that you guys understand far better than I do. Just take it as input in a conversation. I think that, as an adversary, it's a mistake always to underestimate an adversary or to give them the benefit of underestimating them. It's probably the best way to put it. It's always better to try and figure out what is the total breadth of the spectrum of different things that they might employ, and look at the total breadth of their different motivations. And so I think the basic premise of my argument when I first made it is that the things that we know about Putin are the things that he told us about himself. He's an ethno-nationalist. He hates NATO expansion, and he hates the attempt by the Ukrainians to continue to impose a democratic structure on, what he has tried to sort of manage from the outside in a variety of different ways. And after the Maidan Revolution, he reacted to that, by stating that he was going to take Crimea, took Crimea. When he took Crimea, what's interesting is, after taking Sevastopol and securing that important sort of base on the Black Sea, he almost immediately created he took over the Naftogaz assets, gifted them to Gazprom immediately. And then he declared an exclusive economic zone in the Black Sea, which took 80% of all the deep shore energy assets. That's a very specific heist that was planned, right? Then, and this is often ignored, so he got there, he got the strategic position and the deep shore energy assets. Then he started a campaign of, you wouldn't want to use the word terror because it wasn't focused on the civilians so much, but he started a campaign of total destruction of their coal industry. Ukraine has the 6th largest coal reserves in the planet, right? It's extremely important, based in a amazingly located for servicing all of Western Europe and other areas. He began flooding those mines, blowing up rail. This is an unusual thing to do on the Donetsk by these Russian guys. Like, why are they so focused on destroying all the infrastructure around coal, right? So what we know about himself is what he told us, but what we can learn about him and his other motivations are the things that he's actually done in the past. And what we know is he has a very direct and purposeful approach to the commodities in the Ukraine. And he uses the Ukraine as a way station into Western Europe, and increasingly started to create additional capacity to bypass it because he's worried about the Ukraine becoming a democracy. And he's worried about what that would mean for his ability to get his energy in and out of Western Europe. So those are the things that, he told us a few things about himself and what his motivations were for going to Ukraine. Then the things he didn't tell us that seem very obvious are that currently, and this is now evolved to the point that I was saying 3 weeks ago that it would, which is he's now, if the conflict stopped today, he controls 90% of all the Ukraine's energy resources, right? He controls Mariupol, and at the time, Mariupol was still, in play. But I said, he's going to focus on Mariupol to create the land bridge to Crimea. He's going to take that port and use it to get assets out of Donetsk and Luhansk through the Sea of Azov, across the Kerch Strait, Black Sea. This is what he's done. Now, if he could sue for peace today, he would accomplish what Hitler did in Sudetenland in 1938, which is take the piece of the country that's easy for him to control, short supply chains, tactically very straightforward. And he's done it by putting in, he can use missiles to attack other parts of the Ukraine that he wants to keep at bay. And we have a situation where now that he's locking into that space, we have a reduced set of options. Are we going to go in there and try and dig him out? Are the Ukrainians going to be able to fight in that territory in a way that they were incapable of doing for Crimea or for Donetsk and Luhansk? So we have an issue on our hands. And, the Ukraine has the 2nd largest gas reserves in Europe after Norway. One of the pushbacks I've gotten on those facts about just how valuable those reserves are is people say, they have very low production, 23rd. But the point I keep making is that that's not the point. They've been fighting an incursion from the Russians. People say they have very low production of coal. Yeah, they do. They have the 6th largest supply, but they've had their rail blown up, their mines flooded, right? There's been a very specific attempt by Putin all the way, for the last sort of 8-9 years to destroy the ability of Ukraine to become economically independent based on its reserves. And so I think what you have in the Ukraine has to be understood through multiple lenses, and it doesn't take anything away from the ethno-national lens or the NATO expansion lens. And I think maybe mistakes that have been made in the past from the West in pushing too far or treating Putin like an adversary or misreading him completely in multiple different points. I agree with all of that. I think given where we are today, it's important to recognize that in addition to those things, there is this thing, which is the importance of energy as a strategic asset and the importance of the regions that he's taken that hold the energy as a long-term base for him to enhance his control of Western Europe, Western European supply.
With that market share, what are the options for Europe right now? There seems to be much discussion that sanctions will hold, that Europe can go its own way, and walking out on Russia is an option from the market share that Russia has and the supply chains we're dealing with. What are the options? And if it's an inelastic commodity, supply will have to come from somewhere. So how many third order effects are you looking at within this really complex system?
Well, look, I think the biggest problem that you've got is you have a European green movement that has had a dominant sort of rhetorical position of strength in German politics and politics across the European Union, and they are completely beholden to Russian gas. So throughout this entire conflict, they've been spending several $100 million every single day. They've been giving the Ukrainians helmets. The Germans are particularly feckless and have a lot to answer for right now. Their former chancellor is the chairman of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is an unbelievable tactical mistake, and was talking about they've never paid their NATO dues. They are rattling the saber now. They have no saber to rattle. It's a butter knife. It's embarrassing, right? They've sent over $1 trillion to Russia in the last 10 years, and they can't get helmets sent to the Ukrainians on time. Every single day through this conflict, they've been sending several $100 million to the Russians. Every single day through the 2 banks that Putin has said may not be sanctioned, and most recently said I'd prefer it in rubles. They made a big show of sanctions that pummeled the ruble, and the ruble went right back up to where it was pre-conflict as soon as Putin said, I'll take my payment for your gas in rubles, right? They are completely on a short leash of their own making. They handed Putin this leash. If democracy dies in darkness, that little Washington Post thing, they quit giving the light switch to dictators, right? These people are feckless. They have enough shale gas to provide their own energy. They have nuclear capacity that they're shutting down right now. So what they wanted to do from a green perspective is imitate what the US had done by transferring coal on the electrical grid. This electrical grid's growing everywhere in the world. They wanted to transfer coal to natural gas. Natural gas burns at half the carbon intensity of coal per unit of energy. So every time you retrofit your electrical grid onto natural gas, you cut your emissions by half. It's extraordinary. And this is why the US has led the planet in over 800 million tons of carbon reduction on an annualized basis. Across Europe is around 700, so close behind across all the European countries. And almost all of that is due to the retrofit from coal to gas in the electrical grid, almost all of it. But the Greens in Germany, and I think a feckless German leadership, decided that in addition to retrofitting coal to gas and getting the environmental benefits of that, they would get these additional environmental benefits of outsourcing the supply of gas to Russia, number 1, and Algeria, number 2, right? That's where they got their gas supply from. Handing these countries a windfall of the largest economy in Europe, paying them, hundreds of billions of dollars every single year for gas that they could have created themselves or could have fracked for themselves, but they decided fracking was bad. and it made their emissions look good. Now the problem is all emissions are global, right? It's not called domestic emission. It's called global emissions. And emissions that are created in Russia or Algeria to produce the gas and then ship it are all emissions that hit the globe. You've done nothing for the globe except what you think is domestically, politically viable. And so unfortunately, one of the big problems that you see on the political side is the politics has created a complete structural strategic weakness for Germany in Europe now. And as much as they are making promises to pay their NATO dues, the important signal of that is they never have. And why is it suddenly a promise to pay? Like they should have been paying all the way along, right? That level of sort of effects now that they're seeing bodies in the streets in the Ukraine, and they've seen the extraordinary results of empowering a dictator and ignoring the multiple signals that have been sent about his intentions. One of the things Putin learned, I think Putin learned probably strategically one wrong lesson and one right lesson, unfortunately. When he took Crimea, first lesson he learned was you could decapitate the leadership and just watch the region fall. And I think that's what he thought would happen with Kiev. And I think fortunately the Ukrainians, because of some strong NATO training, including some Canadian training that happened when my good friend was defense minister, they've put up a very good fight, and they've got the willingness to take that fight to the Russians. And I think he's backed away from that, and now he's locking into this energy-rich area. I think the other lesson that he learned, unfortunately, which looks correct, is Europe won't care in a year. They made all kinds of noises after Crimea and went straight back to being his best customers immediately within the next year, right? And that energy dependency has only grown. So as long as Europe is in a position where they refuse to create energy independence on their own, or they continue to believe in the myth of wind and solar, you cannot ship wind molecules or sunlight molecules. They don't ship. Only hydrocarbons ship, right? It's that simple. They're not transferable. They have to sit right on the asset that they're meant to support. The other big problem is not only are they not transferable, but they're intermittent. So they don't work for baseload power. You can only get baseload power from coal or gas or nuclear. And they've decided, again, because of these Greens, to even shut down nuclear, which is the only carbon zero resource in Germany. So there's been a series of mistakes that have been made. There's a lot of interest right now in whether there was active Russian influence and why those mistakes were made in the German policymaking process. But to the heart of your question, I don't think Europe is in any position to do anything right now with respect to Russia, except hope for the best, because they've created a complete dependency that has to be in other ways. So they're definitely going to go to Saudi, they're going to go to the UAE. And my argument is this is an opportunity for NATO to step up and make energy security part of its mandate, and to say, actually, NATO member states, Canada and the US, the two largest energy superpowers on the planet, number one, we're in the top 5 in energy production in both oil and gas. We can provide all of the needs of the Europeans for oil and gas right now, all of them, right? The fact that they're dependent on Russia is just a misappropriation of their, of taxpayer dollars, the $600 billion that they spent trying to create a wind energy solution, which, doesn't sustain itself and doesn't make any sense scientifically, is a sign, I think, of how far kind of state capture to a green ideology Europe is in. And I'm hoping that this moment wakes them up, because if it doesn't, you're going to have a new problem. And you're already seeing this start to emerge with Iran. Iran is extraordinary energy power. It's right after Alberta in terms of its base resources. So I feel particularly strongly about this. We had an engagement with some Germans who made it known to me that they thought that Alberta had ESG problems. We weren't environmental enough for them. And I said, wait, we're cleaner than a barrel from California now. The fastest decarbonization of barrel anywhere on the planet's been happening in Canada. They didn't want to hear the conversations about ESG. At the same time, they're doing business full time with Russia and Algeria, right?
Well,
these are not places.
Dead civilians in the street don't count in the ESG formula.
Unfortunately not. I think what they're, but even environmentalism doesn't count in the ESG formula. Tell me how, I went to one of the top hedge funds in London and looked at their scoring of ESG. The Russian assets and the Chinese assets score at the bottom of 200 names in ESG, and the Canadian assets, all 5 majors in Canada, are top 10 globally. So you have a very unusual situation where you have this, default setting in the German political mindset that they can do business with anybody they want without a cost, and you're seeing the cost now. So I don't believe that the premise that these sanctions are working makes sense. I don't think that the Germans have done the least to help the Ukraine of anyone, the least, and they are without answers right now on a whole host of questions about how they have been captured completely by the Russians for the last 10 years, effectively. And so I think that this is a challenge to Germany, basically, principally. Other countries in Europe as well shouldn't get a free ride. But their sudden interest in paying NATO dues and, their defense against sanctioning Russian energy has been interesting. But also their lack of providing the Ukrainians with anything that's really that useful. Estonia has done the most per capita of anyone, So I think that from your perspective on the national security angle, the real opportunity here is to say, what can we do with NATO to make it a powerful platform for European nations to be able to access the extraordinary energy resources of the 2 NATO member states that have the most energy, and how can we utilize that? Because we share the same security objectives, we should be sharing the same energy security trading. And I think that that's an opportunity that can come from smart military leadership, taking a look at the current situation and saying, we can't afford to have this kind of situation cascade. You cannot allow Europe to suddenly turn to Iran for additional supply after the Biden administration does this terrible deal with them, which, by the way, has been going on in Vienna throughout this entire conflict. The Russians have been the interlocutors for the Americans with the Iranians. You can't make this up. My grandfather Knight was a British Army medic and fought in some really rough places. He was in Burma, which I think was one of the worst places to be fighting. I kind of grew up with both grandfathers on both sides. Getting me to read military history, basically, spies and lies, and the good guys, were the good guys. And I have a distant relative, Neville Chamberlain, and he made a bunch of mistakes. And, when you read his history, one of the things that he was doing was he was so concerned about at the time, Germany was the rogue state. He was concerned about how quickly Hitler was getting industrial production up in Germany, and Chamberlain thankfully started the process of rebuilding the British Air Force. But at the same time, he thought he could get away with suing for peace, including Munich. And the Sudetenland was the first kind of canary in the coal mine on this. And what I worry about is when you read that, 10 years ago, you're always shaking your head thinking, how could they have not seen this coming? I mean, this is crazy. Obviously you're empowering this ridiculous person that has this weird combination of ethnocentric, but is also quite wily and dangerous. And what you're seeing right now, unbelievably, is the language of pacifism intersecting with energy politics by politicians that are completely feckless. And so what you've got is, the Biden administration sending emissaries to Venezuela and shutting down Keystone XL. You can't make this up. Taking 800,000 barrels a day from Russia until mid-April, which is the same amount, 850,000 barrels is how much you get through Keystone XL from your next door neighbor in a more climate friendly, more secure supply chain. With another democracy that shares your values and has always fought next to you. Every time there's a conflict anywhere in the world, we're the first ones to put up our hands join our American brothers in defending what we think is right. Not all those conflicts made a lot of sense, but it doesn't stop us from stepping in when the time's right. We go into the fight together because we share the same values, and we're the ones that make the world safe for everyone. And the fact that you've got the Biden administration cap in hand to Iran with Russia holding the cap is extraordinary to me. In Vienna right now, as we speak, right? Incidentally, is the headquarters for OPEC. and you've got them sending emissaries to Venezuela. You've got the Germans with their former chancellor sitting on as like the fact that that guy hasn't announced his resignation from Nord Stream is just blowing my mind. Where's Merkel in this? Where's the accountability for these decisions that have been taken? So if we don't want to live through the horrors of the 40s, we better look at the 1930s and what happened and how that cascade went in the wrong direction and arrest it to the extent that we can. And part of it is, and this is how I ended my article in the Wall Street Journal, steal back this guy's markets. Right now, what we need to do is we need to get rid of the false, fake, and unscientific activist language around the green environmentalist movement that is still wearing the bell bottoms from the 70s intellectually. They haven't caught up to what's actually happened through innovation in free markets. And we need to recognize 80% of global oil is held by non-democratic states, 80% of it, 80%, right? Alberta, Canada has 50% of all the free oil in the world, all the democracy-based oil in the world, 50% of it sits in Alberta, Canada. How can the United States be importing oil from places like Russia and rejecting pipelines from Canada? I'll tell you how. They've bought into a series of meme-like assumptions in their, in the democratic process, funded by trust fund children that fund the Sierra Club and some 350.org and believe they're doing the right thing for the planet, but they're useful idiots for the despotic, anti-democratic states that are actually controlling this energy and have the ability over the next 40 years to use that control of energy, not only to increase their coffers, but to weaponize that energy in different places for spheres of control. And I worry that unless we start to get it right and we start to ship our energy into places like China that's trying to get another 500 million people out of poverty into the middle class, right? And is depending, if we want to lower emissions, they depend on moving their thermal coal-fired grid to gas as well. Why isn't Canadian energy taking 15% of that Chinese coal-fired grid off of thermal coal and onto gas, and in doing so, remove our entire carbon footprint as a nation? We'd be the first net zero nation in the planet, right? Yeah. Canada would, by removing that much global emissions, because we have an enormous supply of gas, a very small population that will never ever utilize it. We've got incredible demand from China and India. And if we don't fill it, I promise you, the reason that Vladimir Putin is so bold right now is because he's already created a market in India, which is strangely quiet on all sanctions right now. And he's created a market and a partnership with Xi. He's taken the two largest energy dependency, fastest growth, energy demand nations in the planet, and he's signing deals with them to make sure that they can get his energy. And that gives him leverage over Europe if Europe decides to walk away off the back of this conflict. And so geopolitically, we don't want to see what has been the, Anglosphere fragmenting out due to our green politics into some self-constrained, incapable of shipping these necessary essential energy products to the places that most need them. That soft power from economic trade is an enormous buttress to the hard power that we may need to use if things have to get kinetic in certain places. But if we're not careful and we keep sending $1 trillion every decade from Europe alone into Russia, he'll have the money that he needs. He'll have the capacity that he needs to take the other things that he wants, much like Hitler was able to generate a much more aggressive set of military adventures out of a economic growth, and we have to stop this. And the best way to stop it is to grow ourselves, outgrow them, outbeat them, and we do. Like the amazing thing to me is Canada doesn't have the gas supply of some of these other countries, but we're top 5 gas producer. I think we're number 4 on the planet right now. US is, I think, number 9 in the planet on, on oil. It's number 1 producer in the planet. These despotic states are all run through national-owned companies, which, like all bureaucracies, fail to actually produce to the capacity they can. They're falling apart in Venezuela, thankfully. Right? Anytime these dictators take control of their assets, they destroy them, because that's how they do it. But if we're not careful and we're not producing, right, then all the advantages that our 20% of supply have, because we allow them to be run by shareholder-led, free market, free enterprise companies that innovate on every front, including cleaner and greener fuels. If we don't allow them to start to trade with the planet, then the despots and the dictators, as poorly run as their businesses are, will continue to do it. And if you fund Maduro's sick and twisted regime in Venezuela, and you fund the Ayatollahs in Iran, and you fund Putin's Russia, then we're asking for a situation that looks to me way too much like the late 30s than what we want.
I appreciate that assessment, and I agree with you. Unfortunately, I don't see us reversing this, and if current trends continue, based on the numbers that you crunch and the market share that's being captured by Putin and the currencies that he's being paid in, what would the timing be? This is always the toughest part. When does this come to a crunch based on what you're seeing?
Well, look, I think there's 3 files that are really dangerous. One is trade deals. Canada should be signing trade deals with India and China for gas. And if we don't, Russia will. Period. Right? The second thing is currency. The default currency has always been the US dollar. Putin and Russia both have an aligned interest in trying to replace US dollar dominance. That's a very dangerous thing. If you think sanctions are failing right now in Russia, wait until no one cares about the US dollar, right? And by the way, when MasterCard and Visa pulled out of Russia, everybody in the West thought that was deadly. It didn't matter. Putin had already seen that game once before, and he immediately flipped to new rails. And MasterCard and Visa didn't take any cash out, and now he's running his own system on his own rails. I mean, you got a real problem in the West with kind of Twitter diplomacy, Twitter politics, which is if it looks good and it runs for a 24-hour news cycle, the political guys pat themselves on the back. Mission accomplished. You've kept your domestic base happy, right? The problem is, the reality is those sanctions were not working. And when guys like me make a point saying, look, I don't take any pleasure in the fact that Putin has multiple strategic impulses and he's highly adaptive, and we have to watch what's going to happen on the energy side, right? The immediate sort of pushback from people is this is just Russian disinformation. And you have to say, look, I want to beat this guy. The problem I have is if our response to every fact that we don't like is that it's disinformation simply because we don't like it, we're going to be going into this late 30s scenario even blinder than we hoped. In 1938, the desire for peace and the desire to create peace by recognizing that they had overstepped and they had created complete devastation in the German economy out of just pure national self-interest and kind of a belligerence. There was sort of almost a recognition that the desire for Germany to achieve what it could economically and stuff, there's almost a desire to let that happen. And I think we forget that because we know how the story ended. But at the time, you look at Chamberlain, there was a ticker tape parade when he came back. There was a clear sense that he'd done absolutely the right thing. There was full endorsement. There was a lot less conflicted feelings than we have even right now. And it was the wrong move. We now know that it was the wrong move. And I think that the important thing right now is not that anybody has to be right. I don't think I'm right. I think I'm partly right about some things. But the importance of this kind of dialogue with, the guys in your cohort that are so intelligent, can see a lot of what I'm doing. And we'll go, I guarantee you, I have a couple of buddies in national security in the States, and they went straight into the maps. They were sending me stuff. So I know you guys are Googling stuff like, actually, yeah, it's the second largest supply of gas, but you know what? They haven't produced it for 10 years. I'm like, trust me, I know. but I don't take anybody's intelligence for granted. I don't think that anybody's an expert on anything. I think there's your guys would know there's a fog of war. You study that. Your tactical doctrine presumes fog of war, right? You have all kinds of default settings in a whole series of things that you guys have embedded in practice that is due to the fact that there's a fog of war, right? The problem we have right now is there's a fog of assessment. Yeah. And when there's intellectual insecurity, and people are just going straight to their dogma, whatever their dogma is, right? It doesn't matter what it is. It could be on the right, it could be on the left, it could be like, Putin's a genius, it could be like Putin's got cancer and it's in his brain, like I've heard it all, right? The point is none of those things really matter. What we know are the facts that we see on the ground and what those facts entail for the next set of decisions that we're going to have to make. We have to take it as a deadweight loss that the Germans have sent over $1 trillion in 10 years to, the Europeans have sent over $1 trillion in 10 years to Putin. That's just done, right? Sadly, that's done. What do we do now? What does NATO do now, right? And I think as long as we have these green dreams that have nothing to do with the actual chemistry of the importance of gas in retrofitting, I mean, the only really powerful climate change outcome decarbonizing the planet has been the retrofit of gas for coal. Wind and solar is a rounding error, right? And yet you've got people saying fossil fuels are bad, and they're including coal, oil, and gas and all those things when one of them is replacing the other at half the emissions rate. So unless we start to see a reset in the domestic political rhetorical narrative, then it makes it harder and harder to have conversations about why what Putin's doing is very much about seizing these assets that could be alternative supply to Western Europe from the supply he has. Now that he has them and his armies are sitting on them, we have a new problem to solve for. Can't look back, cry over spilt milk. What we can do is avoid, making a lot more mistakes going forward by being honest about the mistakes we've made looking back. And right now, I don't even see that level of honesty, particularly when it comes to how much ownership Germany needs to take for the current situation.
Thanks a lot for your time today. I really appreciate it.